Stanislaw Schmeissner's hands were stained with acid and gold dust. He worked standing before a small anvil with an improvised blowtorch and a set of files he had sharpened himself. On the table, inside a metal bowl, lay teeth. Dozens of teeth fitted with gold crowns, extracted only hours earlier from mouths that no longer existed. His task was to melt them down, purify the metal, and turn it into rings, brooches, and small pendants. Not for the Reich, not for any Reichsbank account in Berlin, for Gustav Wagner personally. Schmeissner was 15 years old. He had arrived at Sobibor on the 12th of May 1942 in a transport of roughly 2,000 Jews from the Opole-Lubelski ghetto, together with his father, mother, and sister. All three were sent directly to the gas chambers. He was pulled out of the line because he was carrying a small toolbox and offered himself as a goldsmith, showing a gold monogram as proof of his trade. Wagner, who oversaw the daily selections on the platform, immediately set him aside and also allowed his brother and cousin to join him as assistants, on the grounds that he needed help. That same afternoon, while the rest of his family no longer existed, Schmeissner received his first commission. No one explained the connection between those two facts. There was no need. On paper, Sobibor was a state operation. Every valuable object confiscated from the deportees was supposed to be catalogued, packed, and sent to central offices in Lublin, and from there to Berlin, in accordance with a directive drafted by the SS apparatus itself. With notarial precision, dental gold was to be melted into bars. Foreign currency was to be deposited in the Reichsbank under a fictitious account. Watches were to be repaired and sent to the front. High-quality clothing was to be sorted for German settlers in the East. On paper, nothing was lost, and nothing remained in private hands. In practice, a fraction of that flow was diverted before it ever reached a form. It was diverted into the pockets of the men who administered the killing process. Gustav Wagner, a senior sergeant and deputy commandant of the camp, was the best documented example of that diversion, but he was not the only one. And the fact that the machinery of extermination operated with an efficiency its architects regarded as a technical achievement did not prevent a personal black market from flourishing within that same machinery, protected by the same silence that protected the greater crime. To understand how those two systems coexisted, the logic of bureaucratic genocide and the logic of individual plunder, it is first necessary to understand what Sobibor was and why it existed. Sobibor was neither a prison nor a labor camp. It was a facility built for a single purpose: to kill the greatest possible number of people in the shortest possible time. Its existence was the result of a political decision taken in Berlin in the autumn of 1941, and carried out by an apparatus that transformed genocide into an engineering project. The chosen site, a village at the eastern edge of the Lublin district in occupied Poland, met three conditions: a direct railway line, dense forest that concealed the operations, and enough distance from urban centers to keep smoke and odor from raising immediate questions. Construction began in March 1942 under the supervision of men who had already built Belzec, the first operational camp of what was internally called Aktion Reinhard. The operation intended to exterminate the Jews of the general government. At the head of that inspectorate was Christian Wirth, a former criminal police commissioner nicknamed Christian the Terrible by his own subordinates. Wirth came from the T4 euthanasia program, in which the regime had systematically murdered people with disabilities under the bureaucratic category of lives unworthy of life. Nearly all the German personnel who arrived at Sobibor came from that program. The same gas technicians, the same administrators, the same conviction, cultivated through years of indoctrination, that what they were doing was legitimate and necessary within the political order they served. Wirth brought more than the technique of mass murder. He also brought an attitude toward loot that his subordinates would imitate with little effort to conceal it. Months after Sobibor began operating, an SS judge named Georg Konrad Morgan was assigned to investigate rumors of corruption among concentration camp personnel. Himmler, irritated by what he considered undisciplined looting of the victims, preferred confiscated property to be surrendered in full to the state. Morgan traced the matter back to Wirth through an extraordinary episode: a Jewish wedding held within the orbit of the extermination camps, attended by 1,100 guests, with abundant food and alcohol, and with SS officers present. When Morgan asked Wirth why he had allowed such a spectacle, Wirth replied bluntly that he was acting under orders from the Führer to carry out the destruction of the Jews, and that such gestures helped keep docile the prisoners he still needed alive. Morgan could not proceed against him. Worth was protected by a chain of command that placed extermination above every internal disciplinary code. Months later, the same Morgan followed an even larger rumor that Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police chief in Lublin and operational head of the entire Action Reinhard, had amassed a personal fortune in valuables confiscated from deportees. Globoknik had been expelled from the party in 1938 for corruption, and Himmler had personally rehabilitated him and placed him in charge of Lublin with extraordinary powers. Morgan's investigation never resulted in formal charges. Globoknik was too well protected, and the war itself was moving into a stage in which no one in Berlin had any real interest in pursuing the case to its conclusion. The camp itself was divided into 3 zones, separated by double rows of barbed wire woven with pine branches to block visibility. The first zone contained the administrative buildings, the guards' barracks, and the warehouses. The second was where the trains arrived, where the reception process took place, and where prisoners were stripped of their belongings. The third, called Lager 3 in internal documents, contained the gas chambers. Between the second and third zones ran a narrow fenced passage, roughly 100 meters long, which the Germans called the Schlauch, the tube screened with branches to a height of 2 meters, so that anyone walking through it could see only the sky and the trees at the far end. The camp's first commandant was Franz Stangl, a 34-year-old Austrian trained in the criminal police and with previous experience in the T4 program. Stangl was meticulous, disciplined, and possessed a remarkable ability to separate his administrative duties emotionally from what those duties produced. In interviews given decades later, he described his work at Sobibor in logistical terms, a problem of flow, capacity, and resource management. He never used the word killing, he used the word processing. Under Stangl was a team of between 20 and 30 German and Austrian officers and non-commissioned officers, most of them veterans of the T4 program. Beneath them were the auxiliary guards, mainly Ukrainians and Balts recruited from among Soviet prisoners of war, trained at the Troniki camp and known collectively as Tronikis. Then came the Arbeitsjuden, the work Jews, several hundred people selected from incoming transports because they possessed a skill useful to the functioning of the camp: carpentry, tailoring, shoemaking, mechanics, and, in Smeijner's case, goldsmithing. Gustav Wagner arrived at Sobibor in April 1942, only weeks after construction began, also from the T4 program, where he had worked at the Hartheim Center. He became deputy commandant under Stangl, with the formal title of camp quartermaster, and was placed in charge of one of the most decisive tasks in the entire process: determining on the platform who would be put to work and who would be sent directly to death. When Wagner was on leave or assigned elsewhere, Karl Frenzel took over that role. Among the prisoners, Wagner was feared more than any other officer. One survivor recalled that Wagner never ate lunch without first killing someone. He beat and executed prisoners without any apparent need for justification, and his constant presence throughout the camp made him the most dangerous figure in the daily routine. That same omnipresence allowed him to monitor closely something that interested him as much as disciplinary control: the stream of valuables passing through his hands before reaching any official record. Philip Bialowitz, a survivor of the camp, remembered that after a transport had finished being processed, Wagner ordered him to rake through the sand in the arrival area in search of jewelry and gold that victims might have hidden by hastily burying them in the seconds before entering the Schlauch. This was not an official task. It appeared in no administrative report. It was Wagner using other people's hands to search for what the official system of plunder had failed to capture. Smeijner was removed from the general selection for precisely that reason. Wagner and one of his protégés chose him as a personal goldsmith, responsible for transforming stolen gold, including dental gold extracted from corpses, into jewelry and ornaments for Wagner's private use. The workshop where Smeijner worked stood only a few meters from the barracks where the German officers slept, in the area known as the Swallow's Nest, where Wagner shared quarters with Frenzel and Hubert Gomerski. Every finished piece left that workshop without passing through any Reich inventory. Every piece was, in the strictest sense, theft within theft. The mechanism supplying that workshop began on the platform, at the exact moment a train stopped before Sobibor's unloading area. The halt was controlled, without violent jolts. The guards took up their positions, and the wagon doors remained closed for several minutes while, among the pines, birds continued singing as though nothing were happening. Inside the cars were people who had gone for days without water. When the doors finally opened, A German officer during the first month, sometimes Stengel himself, addressed the new arrivals with a speech whose wording varied, but whose content never did. They had arrived at a transit camp. They would be disinfected and transferred to labor camps in the east, and they were to leave their belongings in an orderly manner, labeled with their names and destination addresses, because everything would be returned to them. The speech worked because people wanted to believe it. They came from ghettos where they had already witnessed earlier deportations, where rumors circulated about what happened in the East, but where uncertainty and the desire to survive created a psychological readiness to accept any explanation that offered an alternative to immediate death. Men and women were separated. The women were taken to a barrack where they had to undress and leave their belongings, and then to another room where members of the Sonderkommando cut their hair, which would be packed and sold to German textile manufacturers. The men went through the same process in another barrack. A group of Jewish prisoners immediately collected and sorted the clothing, shoes, suitcases, documents, and money. There, at that exact stage of sorting, the first breach opened between official plunder and private theft. Obvious valuables, watches, visible rings, banknotes in wallets entered the documented circuit. Numbered containers, forms, regular shipments to Lublin. But gold sewn into the lining of a coat, coins hidden in the sole of a shoe, jewelry swallowed or inserted into the body to avoid detection, and above all, dental gold that appeared only after death inside the chambers, remained in a gray zone where supervision was looser and where an officer with enough authority and few enough scruples could intercept an object before it reached any record. The gas chambers were housed in a building constructed to resemble a bathing facility. The doors were locked from outside. The gas came from an internal combustion engine installed in an adjoining shed, whose carbon monoxide exhaust was piped into the chambers. When the rooms were filled to capacity, the process could take between 15 and 30 minutes. Once it ended, members of the Lager 3 Sonderkommando opened the doors from outside, and their first task was to inspect the bodies for gold, jewelry, or money that might have been concealed. Every object found was supposed to be placed in numbered containers destined for the official system. Supposed to be. In practice, an officer supervising the task with the right intentions could remove an item before it reached the container. Wagner did so often enough that several survivors remembered it decades later in precise detail. Not as an isolated anecdote, but as a recognizable routine. As much a part of daily camp life as the beatings and arbitrary executions Wagner also carried out, without any need for justification. The official system, meanwhile, operated with a precision that deliberately contrasted with this private leakage. A directive dated September 1942 and signed by August Frank, an official in the SS department responsible for concentration camp administration, codified with notarial detail the destination of every category of confiscated property. German currency, foreign currency, precious metals, jewelry, precious and semi-precious stones, pearls, and dental gold were to be deposited with the Reichsbank. Watches, alarm clocks, fountain pens, mechanical pencils, pocket knives, and razors were to be repaired and rapidly sent to troops at the front. Underwear and garments, including footwear, were to be sorted and valued, while pure silk underwear was to be delivered to the Reich Ministry of Economics. Quilts, wool blankets, suiting fabric, shawls, umbrellas, walking sticks, thermos flasks, baby carriages, combs, and handbags were to be sent to the main welfare office for ethnic Germans. Months later, Oswald Pohl, head of the SS main economic and administrative office, sent Himmler a report titled "On the Execution of Textile Salvage from the Jewish Resettlement." The figures he compiled, drawn from the Action Reinhardt camps and Auschwitz-Birkenau, were so precise that they revealed the extent to which plunder had been conceived as yet another production line. 97,000 complete men's suits, 76,000 complete sets of women's clothing, 89,000 sets of women's silk underwear, 2,700,000 kilograms of rags, 62,000 pairs of men's trousers, 132,000 men's shirts, 31,000 pairs of men's shoes. Every figure represented, without naming them, a person who no longer existed. That report, in all its bureaucratic dryness, was exactly what Wagner and men like him avoided producing when they diverted a piece for themselves. The central system measured in tons. Wagner's private system measured in rings, and each ring bore the invisible signature of a teenager forced to melt other people's teeth so that he would not become the next body from which gold was extracted. The coexistence of both systems, state and private, was not a design flaw. It was a direct consequence of the way the regime had structured power inside the camps. Action Reinhardt officers operated with an autonomy that no other level of Nazi bureaucracy would have tolerated under ordinary circumstances. Wirth formally answered to Globoknik, and Globoknik to Himmler. But in the camp's daily reality, the word of a deputy commandant like Wagner was absolute law over the life and death of every prisoner, and that same unlimited authority naturally extended to control over the objects those prisoners left behind. Wagner did not restrict his appetite to gold. He had prisoners make dolls for his children, or simply took them from Jewish children who were about to be exterminated. The object passed from one doomed child's hand to another child's hand, protected by the uniform of her father, without that transfer changing in any way the fate of the child who had lost it. In its smallest form, and in the form least discussed by historians, it was governed by the same logic as the gold melted in Smajner's workshop. Everything the victims owned could become a personal benefit for those who killed them, with no distinction between what was valuable and what was trivial, between precious metal and a toy. Wagner's case was not an anomaly within the Nazi camp system. If anything, it was a more discreet version of what Morgan had discovered at Buchenwald while investigating Commandant Karl Otto Koch, who, together with his wife Ilse, had enriched himself uncontrollably with the money and possessions of prisoners, demanding bribes in exchange for avoiding corporal punishment and accepting payments from wealthy prisoners in return for their release. Morgan discovered that Koch had falsified death certificates to conceal the murder of prisoners who knew too much about his criminal activities. Koch was ultimately tried and executed by a court of the SS itself, not for mass murder, which the regime regarded as legitimate, but for theft, which it regarded as an affront to discipline and to the state's monopoly over the spoils. Wirth, by contrast, never faced charges. His protection came from above, from the same chain of command that allowed him to decide the life and death of hundreds of thousands of people without answering to anyone outside that chain. And that asymmetry, a system that executed one commandant for stealing while protecting another who organized the industrial murder of an entire population, reveals more clearly than any ideological speech the regime's true hierarchy of values. Disorganized looting threatened the administrative control of the state. Organized genocide did not. Smajner remained in Sobibor for 17 months, the entire period in which the camp operated, protected by his usefulness as a goldsmith in a place where the life expectancy of an Arbeitsjude could be measured in weeks. He watched hundreds of prisoners arrive and disappear because they lacked a skill so specifically desired by one particular officer. From his privileged position inside the workshop, he also saw something most prisoners could not: the intimate routines of the German officers, their habits, their schedules, the moments when they entered workshops alone to try on a garment or inspect a personal commission. That same routine, the officer lowering his guard inside a workshop to deal with a private matter, would be exploited months later by a group of prisoners who had reached a conclusion Smajner fully shared. The only way to survive Sobibor was to destroy it from within. In September 1943, a transport arrived at Sobibor from Minsk carrying a group of Red Army soldiers, Jews captured during combat. Among them was a 34-year-old infantry officer named Alexander Pechersky, known as Sasha. He had fought from the first day of the German invasion, been taken prisoner in 1941, passed through several prisoner-of-war camps, and ended up in Sobibor after being identified as Jewish during an inspection. Unlike most Arbeitsjuden, Pechersky understood military organization, tactical planning, and the management of fear in combat situations. In the weeks after his arrival, he began assessing the camp from that perspective. What Pechersky saw was a camp with several hundred Arbeitsjuden watched by German officers and Tronicky guards, an outer perimeter with watchtowers and minefields, weapons stored in the guards' barracks, and a security system designed to prevent individual escapes, not a coordinated rebellion from within. He also saw that the German officers followed fixed routines every day at certain hours, and that some frequently visited the workshops where the Arbeitsjuden worked, to inspect the progress of private commissions in leather or wood, or, in Wagner's case, gold. That routine created windows of access, moments when a German officer stood alone, without an escort, inside a closed space beside a Jewish prisoner. Pechersky made contact with Leon Feldhendler, a Polish Jew who had been a community leader and had spent months unsuccessfully attempting to organize resistance because he lacked the military experience needed to turn intention into a plan. Together they designed what would become the most successful armed uprising ever carried out in a Nazi extermination camp during the war. The plan was simple in concept and extraordinarily precise in execution. During the afternoon of the 14th of October 1943, separate groups of workers would lure German officers into the workshops one at a time and at carefully calculated intervals, under the pretext of showing them completed objects or asking for approval on commissions. Once inside, the officer would be killed silently with axes, shoemakers' knives, and pieces of metal. Almost no firearms were available. The objective was not to seize the camp. It was to eliminate the German command structure quickly enough that, by the time the operation was discovered, too few officers with authority would remain to organize an immediate coordinated response. That afternoon, one officer entered the tailoring workshop to try on a garment. He removed the belt holding his pistol and left it near the door. He was struck with an axe before he could react. Similar scenes unfolded in other workshops over the next 2 hours. Lure an officer inside, isolate him, kill him silently, conceal the body long enough for the next man to enter without suspicion. When the shooting finally began, hundreds of Arbeitsjuden rushed the barbed wire simultaneously. The watchtowers opened fire. In the minefield surrounding part of the perimeter, dozens died within the first minutes. Of the roughly 600 prisoners who attempted to escape, approximately 300 made it out of the camp. In the days that followed, many were captured or murdered by German patrols, local collaborators, or people who betrayed them. By the end of the war, around 50 survivors of the October 14 uprising remained alive. Schmeissner was one of them. He escaped that afternoon, leaving behind the workshop where he had spent 17 months turning the gold of the dead into ornaments for the man who decided who lived and who died. He joined a partisan group in the surrounding forests and survived the war in hiding and in combat, while most of what he had made with his own hands remained somewhere among the private possessions of an officer who, at that moment, had not yet been publicly identified as one of the men directly responsible for the extermination of 200,000 people. Himmler ordered Sobibor closed immediately. The decision was not merely punitive, it was strategic. The uprising meant there were survivors capable of testifying, and Action Reinhard was in any case approaching its final phase. In November 1943, the systematic demolition of the camp began. The barracks were torn down, reusable materials transported elsewhere, the gas chambers destroyed, and their rubble buried. The mass burial pits, which had already been partially emptied as part of Sonderaktion 1005, the SS program to exhume and cremate corpses before the Soviet advance exposed them, were filled with earth. At the end of the process, the Germans planted trees over the site and built a farm on top of the former camp. The destruction of the camp did not, however, destroy the private system that had operated alongside it for 17 months. The objects Wagner and other officers had taken with them, unlike the gold that had reached the Reichsbank, left no documentary trail. No report by Pohl accounted for them. No directive by August Frank classified them. They existed only in the memories of the survivors who had seen them being made, and in the hands of the men who had kept them. Wagner left Sobibor after the uprising and continued serving in other capacities until the end of the war. When Germany collapsed, he fled to Italy, and from there, with the help of escape networks operating through ecclesiastical and South American contacts, reached Brazil, where he lived for more than 3 decades under an identity that local authorities never thoroughly investigated. Franz Stangl, his former commandant, followed a similar route and also ended up in Brazil, although his story had a different ending. He was located and extradited in 1967, tried in Düsseldorf, sentenced to life imprisonment in 1970, and died of a heart attack in his cell the following year. Wagner remained undisturbed until 1978, when an investigation driven by Simon Wiesenthal and Brazilian journalist Mario Cimanovic identified him living in Sao Paulo. Wagner surrendered to the Brazilian authorities before he could be abducted or eliminated by Israeli agents, amid international pressure that included extradition requests from West Germany, Austria, Poland, and Israel. The case became a prolonged legal battle before Brazil's Supreme Court, which ultimately rejected every extradition request. Wagner died in Brazil in 1980 from a stab wound whose nature, suicide or murder, was never conclusively established. He never stood trial for what he had done at Sobibor, nor did he ever answer specifically for the gold he had ordered melted down for himself while administering the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Konrad Morgan, The judge who had questioned Wirth about the Jewish wedding and unsuccessfully followed the trail of Globoknik's fortune, survived the war and testified as a witness before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg in August 1946. There he described his role as an SS investigating judge assigned to examine corruption and abuses in the concentration camps, and recounted how Wirth had explained to him, without hesitation, the systematic murder of Jews in the camps of the general government, trains arriving at disguised stations, welcoming speeches promising resettlement and work, separation by sex, orders to undress for disinfection, sealed chambers presented as showers, the gas, and bodies removed by Jewish forced laborers. Morgan had investigated roughly 800 cases of corruption within the camp system, several of which ended with commandants being executed by SS courts. None of those cases, however, ever touched the heart of the extermination system itself. Morgan could prosecute theft. He could not, and did not intend to, prosecute the genocide that made that theft possible. That distinction, a regime capable of executing its own men for enriching themselves but incapable of questioning the framework that turned mass murder into state policy, reveals how Sobibor functioned internally. Beyond the death factory visible at first glance, in its everyday operation, there was also a parallel economy, in which the value of a human life was measured first by its usefulness to the extermination process, and then, almost as a byproduct, by the gold the body could still yield to anyone holding enough power to take it before it reached an official record. After the war, Stanislaus Meisner emigrated to Brazil, the same country where, initially without his knowledge, Gustav Wagner had also settled. He established himself as a businessman and rebuilt a life far from the workshop where he had spent his adolescence, melting other people's gold. When news of Wagner's identification in Sao Paulo became public in 1978, Meisner was one of the witnesses who confirmed his identity to the Brazilian authorities, recognizing in the elderly man the same person who, 35 years earlier, had ordered him to rake the sand of the platform in search of jewelry hidden by people who would cease to exist within minutes. The identification was not enough to secure extradition. Wagner died in Brazil 2 years later, never having been tried by any court outside the SS organization he had served. The trials that followed the war barely touched this private dimension of the crime. The first trial devoted specifically to Sobibor was held in Hagen, Germany, between 1965 and 1966, with 11 defendants. 8 of the 11 were convicted, receiving sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years in prison. None received a life sentence in that trial. German criminal law required proof of the defendant's direct participation in specific acts of murder, and witnesses available decades after the events could not always identify, with the precision required by the courts, who had killed whom at a particular moment. Defense attorneys systematically exploited that limitation. None of the defendants was thoroughly questioned about the fate of valuables they had personally handled during their service in the camp, because that was not the focus of the indictment. The post-war judicial system had been designed to prosecute homicide, not enrichment, and that asymmetry left unresolved, a question that neither Morgan at the time nor the German courts of the 1960s ever clearly asked. How much of the gold that passed through Sobibor never reached any account of the Reich, and how many private hands did it ultimately enrich in post-war Germany and South America? Archaeological excavations begun in 2007 by Israeli archaeologist Yoram Haimi and Polish archaeologist Wojciech Mazurek, later joined by Dutch archaeologist Ivar Schutt, provided a partial answer, though not to that specific question about the officers, but to a related one: what the victims themselves did with their valuables during the final minutes before losing everything. In a pit within the perimeter of the former camp, the team found approximately 20 gold wedding rings deliberately thrown away by prisoners to prevent them from falling into the hands of their captors. They had not hidden them in the hope of recovering them. They had discarded them as a final act of refusal toward a system that was going to take them by force only minutes later in any case. Among the more than 75,000 objects recovered over years of excavation were earrings, coins, spectacles, perfume bottles, dentures, a Mickey Mouse-shaped brooch belonging to a child, a gold chain set with diamonds, and metal identity tags belonging to Dutch children deported from Amsterdam, whose names made it possible to reconstruct part of their stories 7 decades later. Jaime also found, at various points across the site, a substantial number of alcohol bottles that, unlike the victims' objects, had not belonged to deportees but to camp personnel. They were remnants of a daily life running parallel to extermination. Officers and guards who drank, staged Jewish weddings for temporary amusement, made dolls for their children, and commissioned jewelry from a teenage goldsmith, all within the same perimeter where, only meters away, hundreds of people were being gassed every hour. No report by Pohl or August Frank ever counted those bottles or the jewelry privately commissioned. They were not intended for any Reich inventory. They were intended simply for the comfort and enrichment of the men administering death. And for that very reason, they did not leave the same bureaucratic trail as the official plunder. Karl Frenzel, the non-commissioned officer who replaced Wagner during his absences and commanded Lagerei, the section where the Sonderkommando prisoners worked, was one of those convicted in the Hagen trial. The court found him guilty of personally murdering 6 Jews and participating, through his command role, in the deaths of another 150,000, and sentenced him to life imprisonment. Survivors such as Thomas Blatt recounted how Frenzel shot prisoners directly for minor infractions, including a teenager accused of stealing sardines from the camp kitchen. Frenzel was released in 1982 on a legal technicality, retried, again sentenced to life imprisonment, and eventually freed on health grounds, living as a free man in Germany until his death in 1996. At no stage of that legal process, which extended over nearly 2 decades, was there a specific investigation into what Frenzel had done with the valuables passing through his hands during the months he commanded Lagerei. The medical and legal file concerning his health occupied more pages in the court record than any question about the private fate of the gold and jewelry that circulated under his authority. Of the 11 defendants in Hagen, 5 were completely acquitted. Among them, architect Erwin Lambert, the same man who had supervised construction of the gas chambers and who later described the buildings in almost exclusively architectural terms. Roofing problems, dimensions, materials, without his testimony ever revealing that he had fully processed what those structures did. Another original defendant, Kurt Bolander, took his own life before the trial concluded. A Soviet court in Kiev, in a parallel trial also held in 1965, sentenced 3 former Troniki guards to death by firing squad, prioritizing collective guilt over the individualized forensic proof required by German courts. Neither judicial system, Soviet nor German, ever incorporated into its formal charges the dimension of personal enrichment that had coexisted, day after day, with the extermination process. The victims arrived mainly from nearby Polish ghettos, but also in transports organized from the Netherlands, France, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the occupied Soviet territories. Dutch transports began in 1943 and arrived with an administrative precision reflecting the nature of the occupation in that country, one of the most efficient in Europe in registering and persecuting the Jewish population. Dutch authorities had maintained detailed censuses from before the war, and the German occupation administration used those records to organize deportations with an efficiency that surpassed that of many other occupied territories. Those summoned, received formal notices, were told the exact hour at which they were to report to assembly points, were assured that they could bring luggage, and were informed that their property would be managed until their return. Many Dutch deportees arrived with suitcases packed with enough clothing for a long journey, work tools, and valuables, convinced that the careful documentation they carried would improve their prospects at the destination. Some brought letters from former employers in the Netherlands describing their professional skills. Everything they carried was confiscated within the first minutes after arrival, sorted by the same group of Jewish prisoners working in the reception barracks, and separated according to the categories codified months earlier in August Frank's directive. It was precisely among these Western European transports, which were better documented and accompanied by fuller personal inventories, that the opportunity for private appropriation was most tempting to an officer willing to intercept an object before it reached the central record. Dutch, German, and Austrian deportees tended to carry jewelry of greater value and better quality than those from Polish ghettos impoverished by years of occupation, and that difference did not escape the notice of those who decided, in everyday practice, which piece deserved to be removed from the official circuit. The selection process on the platform itself offered another opportunity, less frequently discussed in the records but present in several survivor testimonies. Some deportees who presented special documents, military certificates, decorations, baptismal records, or papers obtained by their families in the hope that these might protect them were removed from the main group while the documents were examined. In practice, the delay only postponed their deaths by a few hours. But during that interval, the valuables accompanying the documents remained temporarily in the direct custody of an officer without the collective supervision governing the mass processing of the rest of the transport. Wirth himself, in his role as inspector of the 3 Action Reinhard camps, was aware that this margin of leakage existed and that it recurred with variations at Belzec and Treblinka. His tolerance of his subordinates' enrichment was not naivety. It was a form of management. An officer who could personally benefit from administering death had an additional incentive to keep the system operating without friction, not to question orders, and not to allow the fatigue or tedium of repeating the same procedure day after day to degrade its efficiency. Private loot functioned as a silent lubricant inside a machine that otherwise depended entirely on men willing to repeat an atrocity hundreds of times a week for months. That logic also explains why Himmler, despite his declared irritation with undisciplined plunder, never ordered a comprehensive investigation of Sobibor while the camp remained operational. The corruption of Wagner, some of his colleagues, and probably similar officers at Belzec and Treblinka was a cost the regime was willing to absorb so long as it did not threaten the production of extermination or generate the kind of public scandal that had forced intervention in the key case of Koch at Buchenwald, a visible camp, close to German civil society and subject to a degree of scrutiny that the extermination camps of the general government, concealed among forests and operating beyond the view of any population not already designated as victims, simply did not face. When the camp closed in November 1943 and its demolition began, that margin of leakage disappeared with it, not because the regime deliberately shut it down, but because the object of extraction itself, the continued arrival of people and their belongings, ceased to exist. Officers who had served at Sobibor were reassigned to other duties, many of them to Trieste, where they took part in operations against Yugoslav and Italian partisans under the command of Wirth and Globoknik, who transferred much of the Action Reinhard personnel to that region once their original mission in Poland was complete. Wirth died in May 1944, killed by Yugoslav partisans while traveling in an open car. Globoknik himself had been transferred to Trieste in September 1943 under the appearance of a promotion, becoming higher SS and police leader in the operational zone of the Adriatic littoral. A transfer that in reality helped silence the accusations of financial embezzlement already circulating about his administration in Lublin. Even a change of setting did not save him in the end. On the 31st of May 1945, a British armored unit found him hiding in a mountain hut near Lake Weissensee in Carinthia with several close associates. He was taken to Paternion for interrogation. Before questioning could begin, he bit down on a concealed cyanide capsule. He died within minutes, never having answered, before an Allied court or before Morgan, for the ultimate fate of the personal fortune he had accumulated through Action Reinhard. The present-day Sobibor Museum, opened in 2020 on the same ground where the camp once stood, displays roughly 700 objects recovered during excavations, arranged on a 25-meter table lit from below. Among them are a wedding ring bearing a Hebrew inscription, metal tags with the names of children deported from Amsterdam, and fragments of a yellow star made of metal rather than cloth, an unusual variant produced in Slovakia. Every object on that table belonged to an identified or anonymous victim. None of those 700 objects belonged to a German officer. The gold Wagner had melted down for himself, the alcohol bottles from the guards' daily life, and the jewelry commissioned for private use left no comparable museum trace, because they left the camp in the pockets of men who later fled to South America or lived out their lives in German towns, without anyone ever knocking at their doors to demand an inventory. That asymmetry between what remained buried and what the perpetrators carried away is, in a sense, the final layer of Sobibor's operation as a factory of death. The official system of plunder, documented to the kilogram by Pole and classified down to the last object by Frank's directive, became, paradoxically, the more visible one to history. Its figures survived in archives, its categories survived in trials, its routes of shipment survived in the bureaucratic memory of the Reich. Private theft, the theft that led Wagner to order a teenager to rake the sand in search of hidden jewelry. The theft that converted gold teeth into personal rings left little more than the oral testimony of those who witnessed it. And those testimonies, such as those of Schmeissner and Bialowitz, are now the only evidence that it existed. Schmeissner was not a passive observer of the October 1943 uprising. By the time Pechersky and Feldhendler organized the plan, Wagner had promoted him to head of the camp's mechanical workshop, a position that gave him legitimate access to tools and certain restricted areas. Using the pretext of repairing a stove, he entered the quarters of the Ukrainian guards and managed to steal weapons that later proved decisive for the group assigned to attack the German officers. During the uprising that afternoon, Schmeissner fired a gun for the first time in his life, aiming at a guard posted in one of the watchtowers. The same teenager who had spent 17 months turning stolen gold into jewelry for the man who controlled his life and death, ultimately used the access provided by that very assignment to help destroy the system that sustained it. He escaped into the forest that afternoon and joined a partisan group operating in the region. He survived the war and emigrated to Brazil in 1947, where he established himself as a goldsmith, the same trade that had saved his life in Sobibor and that he now practiced in freedom. In 1967, he identified Franz Stangl, helping secure his extradition and subsequent trial in Düsseldorf. 11 years later, in May 1978, he went to a police station in Sao Paulo to confirm personally the identity of another face he had never forgotten: Gustav Wagner. Living under the false name Günther Mendel since obtaining permanent residence in Brazil in 1950, Schmeissner's confirmation, combined with information supplied by the German and Israeli consulates, left no doubt as to the identity of the man who had once ordered him to rake the platform sand in search of jewelry hidden by people who would cease to exist within minutes. Brazil's Supreme Court nevertheless rejected every extradition request submitted by West Germany, Austria, Israel, and Poland, arguing that the crimes were barred by Brazil's 20-year statute of limitations. Wagner remained free, living first under preventive custody and later on a small rural property in Atibaia, near Sao Paulo, where he worked as a caretaker. He attempted suicide on at least 4 documented occasions between 1979 and 1980, cutting his wrists, stabbing himself in the chest and abdomen, and throwing himself in front of a car. On the 3rd of October 1980, he was found dead on the property with a stab wound to the chest, which his lawyer described as a 5th and finally successful suicide attempt. Some local investigators doubted at the time that a man could have inflicted that particular wound on himself. The doubt was never fully resolved, and Wagner died without ever answering before any court for what he had done at Sobibor, or for the gold he had ordered melted down for himself while doing it. Schmeissner returned several times to West Germany to testify in trials connected to Sobibor, including the proceedings against Stangl, and wrote a book about his experience as a teenager in the camp. Published in Brazil in 1968 under the title Infernoem Sobibor. He died in Goiânia in 1989 at the age of 61. During the years he lived in Brazil after the war, he kept 2 rifles wrapped in a blanket in his room. The same weapons that silently recalled the afternoon when he had fired a gun for the first time to escape the place where he had spent his adolescence turning the teeth of the dead into ornaments for their killers. Today, on the ground where Sobibor once stood, the forest has grown back over what the Germans tried to bury twice. First beneath the disturbed soil of the pits, then beneath the trees planted to conceal every trace. Under that second layer of pines remain the concrete foundations of the gas chambers, located only in 2014. On the illuminated table in the present museum lie 700 objects recovered from that soil, rings thrown into a pit by hands that preferred to lose them rather than surrender them. Identification tags belonging to children who never had the chance to grow up, a gold chain set with diamonds that once belonged to someone with a name. There is no object in that museum made by Stanislaw Schmeissner. The gold that passed through his hands during those 17 months transformed into rings and brooches for a man who measured the value of human life by the usefulness he could extract before killing it, left the camp in its owner's pocket, and disappeared somewhere between Sao Paulo and Atibaia, never to be traced again. The only thing that survived from that forced labor was Schmeissner's own memory, repeated before German judges, at a Brazilian police station, and finally in a book written on a rural estate where, at night, a man who had once melted other people's gold in order to survive, listened to music and kept 2 rifles wrapped in a blanket, the only objects from those years he had chosen to preserve for himself.